Hello and welcome. Today I'd like to describe the technique to make a silver lined wooden ring like this one. This is Indian rosewood on the sterling silver core. The core is shaped for a comfortable fit and the wood outer is finished to a high sheen with carnauba wax. The process is fairly simple but does require some jewellery and woodworking tools. I'll cover that as we go. I'm using 0.3mm recycled sterling silver for the core. The first step is to mark out the width of the band. I've set my dividers to 7mm, which seems to be a comfortable width. I've marked out the length to about 5mm longer than I need to allow for any mistakes. Once this is marked out, it's ready to be sawn. I'm using a jeweller's saw and a bench peg to cut the silver. The blade's been lubricated with beeswax to make it easier to use and less likely to break. In order to set the ring size correctly, I use this handy little jig that I made. If you don't have something similar, there are tables of band lengths available in Google, or if this is going to be a one-off ring, measuring the finger with a bit of paper is equally effective. I'm aiming for a size T in UK sizes. One thing to remember is that the band will stretch by about a size during the forming process, so this will need to be allowed for. I've done this here by setting the length for a size S. Once marked, the surplus is sawn off. The ends of the band need to be squared up to make a good connection for soldering. I'm just lightly filing the end here to make it square. Since this is sterling silver, I'm marking the band to show that. I'm using a punch and marking the silver quite deeply. This may look excessive now, but the mark will become more reasonable as the forming process progresses. There's a lot of hammering to come yet. At the moment, we just have a flat bit of silver that doesn't resemble a ring in any way currently. The first step along that path is to form that flat band into something vaguely ring-shaped. I'm using ring-forming pliers, but this can be done with any small pliers, or even just using your fingers since the silver is quite thin and easily bent. I'm not too concerned at this stage in making it round. More important now is to make sure that the ends butt up nicely so that it can be soldered. Those ends are now nicely aligned, so that is now ready for soldering. I've mounted the ring in a small clamp to make the soldering a bit easier. I've applied a drop of flux to make the solder flow properly. I'm using commercial flux, but a bit of borax dissolved in water is just as effective. Lightly warm the flux to drive off the water. This gives the solder something to stick to and not fall off. Add a small piece, the correct name is a pallion, of solder to cover the joint. I'm using medium solder here. A drop more flux helps it to keep it in place. Once it is fixed, heat the joint more strongly to melt the solder and flow it into the joint. Be very careful not to overheat it. The melting point of the solder is not very much below that of the silver itself, and it's very easy to melt the ring entirely. Heating from below will help the solder flow into the joint. Once the joint is soldered, the ring can be pickled to remove the fire scale. This is unfortunately not a particularly pretty solder joint. The two ends slip slightly during the soldering process. I'll correct this later with some judicious filing and grinding. What's the matter? Please excuse the cat. She's complaining because it's raining outside and she doesn't like it. Now that we have a continuous piece of silver, it's time to start making it actually ring shaped. This is done in two stages, and the first is to get it roughly ring shaped using a mandrel and a soft faced hammer. I'm tapping with the hammer and rotating the mandrel to ensure that all the irregularities and kinks are worked out. I turn the ring over on the mandrel part way through to ensure that I don't end up with a conical core. As I've mentioned, I'm not very happy with the solder joint. There's a bit of an overlap where the two sides of the joint slip slightly. In order to correct that, I'm going to grind the lumpy bits gently with a grinder on a pendant drill. I'm going to be quite careful doing this. I don't want to grind away too much, and I don't want the ring to slip and possibly cut my fingers. The ring also gets quite hot in the process. I keep turning the ring round to ensure I don't get any thin spots. For any really large lumps, I'll use a curved needle file for its more aggressive cut. So that's a little better. Any remaining lumps and bumps will get cleaned out during the final finishing process. The second stage of forming the ring is to make it a little more comfortable to wear. At the moment this is a straight-sided ring, but we want to make this better shaped to the finger. To do that, I'm going to use a shaped ring mandrel to give the ring an inward curve and a smoother fit. A specially shaped hammer puts the curve into the silver. This is called an anticlastic curve. I will work around the ring many times to get a smooth curve. Now you can see the final shape of the silver core. This is far more comfortable on the finger. A little bit more cleaning up and it will be ready for the wood to be applied. I'm just going to lightly clean up the inside of the ring with a bit of fairly coarse emery. This is just to remove some of the scratches resulting from the forming process. I'm using 320 grit emery here. I will work up to much higher grits during the final finishing process and then complete the treatment with a couple of grades of burnishing compound for a really bright shine. I won't be doing that though until the wood has been applied. So that is now ready for the wood. This is the wood blank that I will be using to make the actual ring itself. This is a small piece of Indian rosewood, and you can see that it is about 33 centimetres square and a centimetre thick. This wood comes, as the name suggests, from southern and eastern India where it grows abundantly. It's a nice dense hardwood with rich colouring. It's not an endangered species. The blank is cut into 2 equal pieces along the grain on the bandsaw. I will be using them back to back with the smooth machine surfaces together. This might slightly disrupt the grain pattern of the wood, but this won't be noticeable in the finished item. Since the 2 parts will be mounted together, but not stuck together, on the lathe, I marked the ends of the wood with a pencil to make it clear which way round they go. Because they will be removed and replaced on the lathe several times during the process, it is important not to get one of them accidentally turned around. The marks will help me here. I want to make the initial hole in the wood slightly smaller than the diameter of the core itself. I'm using a pair of dividers here to measure the diameter of the narrowest part of the core. I'm then setting them slightly narrower still to give me some room for fine adjustment and wiggle room when I come to form the inside curve of the wood later. I'm using my standard 80mm wood turning chuck to hold the 2 pieces of the blank in the lathe. However, I don't want the work to sit too deep in the chuck, so I have placed a plywood spacer in the chuck first. This leaves about 2mm of grip, which is more than sufficient for this tiny bit of wood. I'm drilling a hole with a 15mm Forstner bit in the tailstock. The lathe speed is turned down for this. This hole will give me a start on further work in the interior of the blank later. Having measured the diameter of the core, I can now use the dividers to mark the blank where I want to take out the bulk of the wood. It's important when doing this to only use one point of the dividers to score the wood. Sticking both points in can lead to a nasty accident. Now I can remove the centre of the blank up to my scored line to give me a hole close to the final diameter. I'm using a square-ended carbide scraper for this, but a spindle gouge works as well. I've turned the lathe speed up a bit here to about 900 RPM to give me a slightly better cut. although at this stage a beautiful finish is not so important. Turning at a higher speed also reduces the risk of the wood splintering. This wood can be a little brittle. Here I'm using a 1/4 inch spindle gouge to refine the hole into an inward curve to match the silver core. During this stage I will remove the pieces of wood several times to turn them round to get an even curve, and also to check the size against the core itself. This is where those pencil marks become in really helpful. I'm taking very gentle cuts here. I don't need to remove a lot of wood, and it's very easy to make the hole too big. The forming of the hole is now complete, and I'm making a final check of the size against the core. You can do this using a micrometer, but I find that checking the fit by eye is more than sufficient. I'm checking two things here. Firstly, that I've got the hole the right diameter, and also that I've got the profile of the interior of the hole matching the curve of the core. This is something that will need to be done several times during the working of the wood blank. With the core made and the wood worked to fit that core, the two can be assembled. I'm using a high viscosity superglue here for that purpose. Firstly, I'm applying glue to the lower half of the wood before carefully placing the core. I then apply glue to the top half, making sure that I put some on the two facing ends, and place the second half of the wood. Finally, the whole thing is clamped and left for the glue to cure. I'm not using accelerant for the super glue here, as it reduces the penetration into the wood and creates a less strong bond. The glue has now cured, and the ring can be sanded down to close to its final size. I'm starting by sanding the faces down to the size of the core. Very slightly over sand so that I catch the very edge of the silver to ensure that there's no overhang of the wood. I'll tidy that silver edge up in the next step. In order to finish the silver core, I have remounted the piece in the lathe, using my plywood spacer again to keep the wood fairly proud of the chuck jaws. I'm going to use an agate knife to burnish the edges of the silver smooth. By working the agate from the centre to the edge and following the contour of the core, any last lumps and bumps are worked out and the edge is smooth. Don't press too hard here. A light pressure is all that is needed. Once I've burnished the silver, I work it over again with 800 and 2500 grit emery cloths for a bright finish. It will get a final polish later. Turn the piece over and repeat on the other side. As you can see, this really brings out the beauty of the silver. I am now striking off the corners with a sanding disc. I usually use a bandsaw for this as it is quicker, but the sanding is probably a little safer. I'm doing this to reduce the amount of wood that needs to be removed from the lathe, and to make it less likely to catch the gouge or splinter the wood. For the final shaping of the ring, I'm using a homemade ring mandrel on the lathe. This is just turned up from a piece of scrap wood. The ring is just pressed onto the conical mandrel and adjusted to make it run true. Commercially made mandrels are available, but they're a little expensive and it's possible to split the ring if they're tightened up too enthusiastically. I'm taking very light cuts here with a 1/4 inch spindle gouge. I want to avoid catches, and if cutting too aggressively in the down direction, away from the lathe, it is very easy to push the ring off the mandrel. I'll speed it up the video here. I'm aiming for a nice domed profile to the wood, and I'm working down the sides towards the core, but being very careful not to catch the silver with the gouge. I'm now sanding the wood lightly with a range of sanding sheets. I'm starting with 80 grit and working up to 180 grit prior to sealing the wood. I don't want to sand too aggressively, as this may heat up the ring too much and split the wood. I'm applying 2 coats of cellulose sanding sealer. This is the second coat. Very little is needed, and I'm being quite careful not to get it between the silver and the mandrel, just because it is a pain to clean up afterwards. If it does get on the silver, it can be cleaned off with cellulose thinners or acetone. It dries in seconds, and then I can continue sanding from 180 grit up to 600 grit. For a final high sheen, I'm finishing off with an abrasive wax paste. This should give a finish of about 1000 grit. I just smear a small amount on and then work it off with a piece of towel on the spinning lathe. It's done when the towel remains clean. For final lustrous finish, I'm using Carnauba wax. This is supplied as a hard stick of wax which is held against the spinning work. The little wax melts off onto that work. I'm making sure that I have covered all the wood. Now I have turned the lathe speed up a bit and I'm using a piece of rag to burnish the wax. You need to apply enough pressure to actually melt the wax. And there we have a nice shiny ring. The last step is to give the silver core one last polish to a bright finish. I'm using blue burnishing compound for the first stage. I've applied this to a felt pad and a pendant drill and I'm working around the insides of the ring, making sure I go over all the silver. Once again, only a light pressure is needed. I don't want to overheat the ring. The very last polish is done with red compound. This is the highest level of polishing material for a mirror bright finish. Thank you for watching.